God! God! God!
Count one would be 10,000.
Courtrooms demand respect. But what happens when kids show up with zero remorse and an attitude to match? From a teen who boldly argued with a judge over his phone to another who heartlessly mocked a victim's grieving mother, these young offenders showed a shocking lack of respect when it mattered most.
It's conflict of interest between me and the man. I want to file a verbal motion.
Join us in this video as we take a look at 8 most disrespectful courtroom kid moments. Number 8. William Demopoulos. 18-year-old William Demopoulos from Berea, Ohio, found himself in court for what should have been a regular probation hearing. He was facing charges for criminal damage, unauthorized use of a motor vehicle, and obstructing justice. It seemed like a routine day, but William had something else in mind.
18-year-old William Demopoulos. He's on probation for criminal damaging, unauthorized use of a motor vehicle, and obstructing official business.
The hearing started out like normal, but things took a turn when Judge Chris Green asked William to hand over his phone to the probation officer. Now, for most people, this wouldn't be a big deal.
As Judge Chris Green is annoyed with Demopoulos for refusing to hand over his cell phone to a probation officer.
But for William, it was a major problem. He flat out refused to give up his phone, holding on to it as if it was the most valuable thing in the world. You could tell right then that this wasn't going to end well for him. The judge patiently explained the rules of probation and why William had to hand over the phone. He even broke it down in simple terms, making sure William understood the situation. But William wasn't hearing it. He insisted, "It's not like that," trying to defend himself. But anyone watching could tell it was exactly like that. William just didn't want to let go of the phone. At this point, the judge had had enough. His patience ran out, and he ordered the deputies to place William in handcuffs. And instead of calmly accepting what was coming, William decided to make things worse for himself. In a shocking move, he jumped up onto the courtroom table like he was planning to make some kind of dramatic escape. But let's be real, there wasn't anywhere for him to go. The officers quickly reacted, grabbing William and pulling him back down before he could even get his footing. The whole thing only lasted a few seconds, but those few seconds were enough to make everything worse for William. The courtroom calmed down after the brief chaos. But for William, the damage was already done. The judge wasn't about to ignore what had just happened. Not only did he revoke William's probation, but he also added another charge, resisting arrest. And to top it all off, the judge sentenced William to 40 days in jail. What started as a simple probation hearing turned into a full-blown mess, all because William refused to give up his phone. Instead of walking out of court with his freedom,
"Give me that phone. What's in that phone you don't want us to find?"
he walked out with handcuffs and a jail sentence. It's a lesson in how things can quickly spiral out of control when you don't follow the rules. William could have avoided all of this, but in the end, his phone cost him his freedom. Number 7. Penelope Soto. Penelope Soto's court appearance on February 4, 2013, was anything but ordinary. Facing charges for possessing Xanax, a controlled substance, she should have been taking the situation seriously.
After 4 nights in jail, Soto apologized to the judge and explained that she was still high on alcohol and Xanax.
However, the moment she walked into the courtroom, it was clear she had no intention of showing respect. Her attitude, demeanor, and complete disregard for the proceedings set the stage for a hearing that no one would forget. Things kicked off with Judge Jorge Rodriguez Chomat asking Soto some basic questions about her finances. Instead of answering like someone who was facing serious charges, she responded with an attitude. Her tone was snarky, and she was laughing, as if the whole thing didn't matter to her at all. When the judge asked her if she owned anything of value, Soto casually mentioned her jewelry, saying it was worth a lot of money. But the judge wasn't impressed by her answers, and it was obvious he wasn't amused by her behavior. Then came a key moment. The judge asked if she had taken any drugs in the past 24 hours. Soto, without hesitation, denied it, but her actions told a different story. She was acting strange, jittery even. Despite her claim, it was pretty clear to everyone watching that something wasn't quite right with how she was behaving. Still, the judge didn't push it any further and went ahead with setting her bond at $5,000.
Had no prior run-ins with the law. So Dade County Circuit Judge Jose Rodriguez-Chamat set bail at $5,000.
Now, most people in that situation would start realizing how serious things were, but not Soto. Instead of taking the judge's decision seriously, she smirked and laughed as she turned to walk away. And then, just as she was about to leave, she mumbled something rude under her breath. Judge Rodriguez-Chamat didn't let that slide. He immediately called her back, and with no hesitation, he doubled her bond from $5,000 to $10,000. It was a clear message. He wasn't going to put up with her disrespect.
Count one would be 10,000.
Are you serious?
I am serious. Adios.
But even this wasn't enough to get through to Soto. Instead of calming down, she made things worse. As she walked away again, she yelled a curse word at the judge.
Okay, that's fine.
Our whole system depends on respect for judges and their orders, and when there's outrageous disrespect,
Loud enough for the whole courtroom to hear. That was it. The judge had heard enough. Without missing a beat, he found her in direct contempt of court and sentenced her to 30 days in county jail, right on the spot.
Oh, you did say that? I find you in direct criminal contempt. 30 days in the county jail.
The whole courtroom seemed to freeze as Soto realized she had gone way too far. What started as a routine hearing for drug charges turned into a complete disaster for her. But the story didn't end there. Soto's behavior was all caught on camera, and before long, the video of the courtroom exchange went viral. People everywhere couldn't believe how she had acted in front of the judge, and it became one of the most talked about moments online. Soto's courtroom meltdown was suddenly all over the internet, with everyone watching her throw her chance at leniency out the window. However, just 2 days later, there was a twist. The court decided to reduce her bond back to the original $5,000, giving her a chance to fix her mistake. 4 days after her wild outburst, Soto returned to the courtroom, but this time, she wasn't the same person. She had clearly thought long and hard about her actions. When she stood before the judge again, she was calm, quiet, and respectful. She apologized sincerely, calling her previous behavior irrational.
My behavior was very irrational, and I apologize not only to the court.
She owned up to what she had done, and Judge Rodriguez-Chamat could see that she was truly sorry. Seeing her change of heart, the judge decided to show her some mercy. He revoked the 30 days jail sentence and instead ordered her to complete a drug treatment program. Soto took this second chance seriously
and has volunteered to attend a drug rehabilitation clinic. A much more forgiving judge vacated Soto's 30-day sentence.
Over the next year, she worked hard to finish the program, and by the end of it, her drug charges were dropped. It was a huge turnaround for someone who had started off by disrespecting the court in such a major way. This story became more than just about Penelope Soto's day in court. It turned into a lesson for anyone who thinks they can behave however they want in a courtroom and get away with it. Number 6. Alyssa Bustamante. Alyssa Bustamante's story is one that will leave you absolutely shaken. She wasn't your typical 15-year-old girl. In 2009, in a small, quiet town in Missouri, she did something that no one could have ever imagined.
Alyssa Bustamante is still recognizable as the teenager arrested in the fall of 2009.
Something so horrible it still haunts people today. Alyssa lived next door to 9-year-old Elizabeth Olton, a sweet little girl who trusted Alyssa because, after all, they were neighbors. Elizabeth thought Alyssa was a friend, someone safe. But one day, when Elizabeth went outside to play, Alyssa had other plans that would lead to something truly terrifying. It all started when Elizabeth's little sister, Emma, asked her mom if Elizabeth could come out to play. Her mom said yes, but she told Elizabeth to make sure she was home by 6 p.m. Elizabeth agreed and headed out, but she would never return home that evening. Instead of playing like they usually would, Alyssa convinced Elizabeth to follow her into a wooded area near their homes. Alyssa told her she had something special to show her. What Elizabeth didn't know was that Alyssa had been planning something awful. Once they were deep in the woods, things took a horrifying turn. Alyssa attacked Elizabeth, first strangling her and then stabbing her over and over again.
The murder of 9-year-old neighbor Elizabeth Olton. If convicted of first-degree murder, Bustamante could not have been executed.
It was brutal, far worse than anyone could imagine, especially considering how young both girls were. Afterward, Alyssa buried Elizabeth's body in a shallow grave she had dug earlier, a grave she had prepared before even luring Elizabeth into the woods. Back at home, Elizabeth's family started to worry when she didn't come back at the expected time. Her mom had told her to be home by 6, but as the clock ticked past that time, the panic began to set in. The entire neighborhood joined in the search, hoping to find Elizabeth safe and sound, not realizing the awful truth. Elizabeth was already gone. As the search went on, Alyssa acted like nothing had happened. She even told her sister Emma to keep quiet and not say a word about Elizabeth. And Emma, scared and confused, did just that. Days went by, and still, no one could find Elizabeth. It was then that the police started to focus on Alyssa. At first, no one really suspected her. She was young and seemed like just another teenager, but little things began to raise red flags. For example, Alyssa's behavior was strange, too calm for someone whose neighbor had gone missing. And when the police questioned her about a hole they found in the woods, Alyssa casually admitted that she had dug it, but said it was just for fun. That's when things started to unravel. The police began digging deeper into Alyssa's life and discovered some deeply disturbing things on her social media. There were posts that hinted at violent thoughts, and they found out she had a dark side that no one had noticed before. But the most horrifying discovery came from Alyssa's very own diary. In her diary, Alyssa had written in chilling detail about the day she killed Elizabeth. She described it as amazing and said it had given her a rush like nothing else. This diary entry was the final piece of the puzzle. Alyssa had written down exactly what she had done, and there was no denying the truth any longer. When the police confronted her, Alyssa confessed. She led them to the grave where she had buried Elizabeth. The entire community was in shock. No one could believe that a 15-year-old girl had done something so terrible to someone she knew, someone who trusted her. At Alyssa's trial, she first pleaded not guilty, but it wasn't long before she changed her plea to guilty.
She says that ruling changed her thinking.
Basically, the main reason for...
The diary entries were read out loud in court, and they showed just how cold and calculated Alyssa's actions had been. She had planned the murder, carried it out, and even enjoyed it. It was more than anyone could comprehend. In the end, Alyssa was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, plus 30 years for armed criminal action. But Elizabeth's family didn't feel like justice had been served. They didn't believe Alyssa should ever get out of prison. And during the sentencing, Elizabeth's mom made it clear just how angry and heartbroken she was. Alyssa did express some regret during her sentencing. She apologized, saying she was sorry for what she had done. But to Elizabeth's family, those words weren't enough. Nothing could bring their little girl back, and no apology could erase the pain of losing her in such a horrible way. This case shocked not just the small town where it happened, but the entire nation. People couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that someone so young could commit such a terrible crime. Number 5. T.J. Lane. This story is about T.J. Lane, and it's one that still sends chills down the spine. In February 2012, Lane walked into Chardon High School in Ohio, where he was just another student. But that all changed in an instant when he pulled out a gun and opened fire on his classmates. The date was February 27th.
T.J. Lane as he pleads guilty to the murders of 3 of his classmates.
And what should have been a regular school day turned into a nightmare that would never be forgotten. It was the cafeteria where the shooting began. Kids were grabbing food, talking with their friends, completely unaware of what was about to happen. And then, suddenly, shots rang out. Panic erupted. Students ran for cover, and 911 calls flooded in as terrified kids and teachers tried to make sense of the chaos. T.J. Lane had started his deadly rampage, leaving destruction in his path.
We asked Michelle Miller to find out what she could about the suspect, T.J. Lane.
One of the heroes that day was the school's assistant football coach, Frank Hall. As soon as he realized what was happening, he didn't hesitate. He chased Lane out of the building, not caring about his own safety.
He's the assistant football coach who chased the gunman out of the school.
Hall's bravery likely saved more lives, as Lane was soon found outside by the police and taken into custody. But the damage had already been done. 3 young lives were lost because of Lane's actions. 16-year-old Daniel Parmertor was killed right there in the cafeteria. 17-year-old Russell King Jr. and 16-year-old Demetrius Hewlin were rushed to the hospital, but sadly didn't survive. Another student, Nick Walzak, was shot as well, and though he lived, he was left paralyzed for the rest of his life. All of these kids were just going about their day, never imagining that it would be their last. Lane was only 17 years old when he committed these terrible crimes, but the court didn't see him as just a kid. He was charged as an adult with 3 counts of murder. People who knew him described him as quiet and someone who mostly kept to himself, but as more details emerged, it became clear that Lane had a troubled past. His home life was far from stable. His father had been to prison for assault, and his mother wasn't around much. Lane's friends said he seemed lost, but no one expected anything like this. When it came time for court, Lane first tried to use insanity as his defense. He claimed he heard voices in his head telling him what to do, but after some evaluations, the court ruled that he was competent to stand trial. To avoid the death penalty, Lane eventually pleaded guilty to the murders. But if you thought he would show any remorse, you'd be wrong. During his sentencing, the families of the victims had a chance to speak. They stood in court, heartbroken, pouring out their grief to the boy who had taken their children away from them. But instead of showing regret, Lane did something shocking. He walked into the courtroom with a smile on his face and then unbuttoned his shirt, revealing a white t-shirt underneath with the word "killer" scrawled across it. This was the same kind of shirt he had worn the day of the shooting. He wore it like a badge, proud of what he had done. As if that wasn't enough, Lane looked the grieving families right in the eyes and said something that no one will ever forget. With a cold grin, he told them, "This hand that pulled the trigger, that killed your son." There was no apology, no sign of guilt, just a heartless killer mocking the pain he had caused. In the end, T.J. Lane was sentenced to life in prison without any possibility of parole. For the families of the victims, there was no real comfort in that. Their children were gone, and nothing could bring them back. But at least they knew that Lane would never be free to hurt anyone again. Number 4. Tevin Merryweather. Tevin Merryweather, a 25-year-old man from Lithonia, Georgia, found himself facing serious charges after a fatal shooting. The incident happened on June 2, 2019, at a Shell gas station located on Glenwood Avenue in DeKalb County. Merryweather was accused of killing 34-year-old Myron Pierce. According to Merryweather, the situation escalated during an altercation, and he claimed that he shot Pierce in self-defense. However, the prosecution argued that the shooting was unjustified, leading to a murder charge against Merryweather. As the trial began, emotions ran high in the courtroom, especially for Myron Pierce's family, who were struggling with the grief of losing him. One person in particular who couldn't hold back her emotions was Myron's 15-year-old daughter, Tashia Campbell. She had to sit through the painful details of how her father was killed, listening as the prosecutor described the events that led up to the fatal shooting. The weight of the moment became too much for Tashia to bear. In a heartbreaking scene, Tashia stood up during the court proceedings and shouted in anger and pain, "Why'd you kill my daddy?" Her grief was clear to everyone present. She then tried to lunge at Tevin Merryweather, the man accused of killing her father, unable to contain the overwhelming emotions that had been building up inside her. The courtroom was thrown into a moment of chaos as deputies quickly intervened, rushing to restrain Tashia and prevent her from reaching Merryweather. They removed her from the courtroom, trying to calm the situation before it escalated further. This emotional outburst from Tashia highlighted just how deeply the tragedy had impacted Myron Pierce's family. The pain and anger she felt were shared by her loved ones, but she was the one who couldn't hold it in any longer. For the family, seeing the man accused of taking their father's life was too much to handle, and Tashia's reaction showed just how raw their grief was. The case continued, but the incident in court left a lasting impression on everyone there. Tashia's outburst was not just a moment of anger, but a reflection of the deep sorrow and confusion that comes with such senseless loss. As for Tevin Merryweather, his defense centered around the claim of self-defense. However, details about the final outcome of the trial remain unclear. The court system can be a long and painful process for families seeking justice, and the Pierce family continues to grapple with the loss of their loved one while waiting for the legal proceedings to unfold. Before we continue, it's time for today's subscriber's pick. Take a look at this picture. Shocking, right? You're probably wondering, how could an 8-year-old end up in chains, in court, or even sentenced to death? The reality is that laws regarding young offenders vary widely across different countries. In the United States, most states consider anyone under 18 a juvenile. However, some states allow 16 and 17-year-olds to be tried as adults for serious crimes. Children under 12 are rarely sent to juvenile detention unless their offenses are extreme. Around the world, different nations have their own standards. In the United Kingdom, juvenile courts handle cases for individuals between the ages of 10 and 17. In Canada, youth criminal laws apply to those between 12 and 17. Meanwhile, in Australia, the age of criminal responsibility begins at 10, with juvenile detention applying to those between 10 and 17. So viewers, we'd like to know your thoughts regarding this picture. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Number 3. Vashon Flowers. Vashon Flowers, a 46-year-old man from Muskegon Heights, Michigan, was convicted of first-degree murder for the tragic death of his wife, Jamie Thomas Flowers. The heartbreaking event occurred on May 19, 2019, at their shared home. Leading up to the incident, Flowers and Jamie had a tumultuous relationship, which culminated in a violent argument on the evening of May 18, 2019. According to reports, their daughter, Paris Jones, was present during this argument and witnessed the physical altercation between her parents. Flowers had assaulted Jamie during the confrontation, leaving her emotionally shaken. After the argument, Jamie demanded that Flowers leave their home, and he did. However, the next morning, on May 19, 2019, Flowers returned to the residence. It was at this point that the situation turned deadly. Paris was in another bedroom with her young son when she heard several gunshots.
And it happened while the victim's daughter and grandson hid in a bedroom inside the Muskegon Heights home.
Rushing out, she found her mother fatally wounded, having been shot by Flowers. The devastation was instant, as Flowers had taken Jamie's life in an act of senseless violence. In the days that followed, Flowers was arrested and charged with murder. The case quickly went to trial, and the courtroom proceedings were highly emotional, especially for Jamie's family. During the trial, Paris Jones, who had not only lost her mother,
He got down on the ground and started choking my mother.
but had also witnessed the immediate aftermath of the killing, was overwhelmed with grief and anger. In a dramatic courtroom moment, she attempted to attack Flowers as he stood trial for the murder of her mother. Law enforcement officers in the courtroom had to step in immediately, restraining and handcuffing her to prevent the situation from escalating further. This courtroom outburst highlighted the deep emotional scars that such violent crimes leave on the families of victims. For Paris, watching the man who killed her mother stand before the court without being able to do anything about it was too much to bear. Her attempt to physically confront Flowers was a reflection of the anger, pain, and helplessness that she and the rest of Jamie's family had been feeling since the tragic event. Flowers' trial lasted 4 days, and after hearing the evidence and testimonies, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. Given his previous criminal history, which included drug-related offenses and resisting arrest, Flowers was also sentenced as a fourth-time habitual offender. On March 13, 2020, the court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His criminal record and the severity of his actions during the killing of his wife meant that there would be no chance of him ever being released. Vashon Flowers is currently serving his life sentence at the Lakeland Correctional Facility in Coldwater, Michigan. For the family of Jamie Thomas Flowers, the loss of their loved one, compounded by the painful memories of the courtroom trial, is a wound that will take a lifetime to heal. The courtroom scene, where Paris attempted to attack the man responsible for her mother's death, captured the raw emotions that ripple through families torn apart by violence. Number 2. Danta Wright. In Ann Arbor, Michigan, a tense courtroom awaited the sentencing of 17-year-old Danta Wright, a teenager whose actions had left an entire community in disbelief. He had already confessed to killing high school student Jordan Clee during a robbery. However, what shocked many even more than the crime itself was Wright's apparent lack of remorse. The tragedy unfolded in October 2016 near Pine Lake Village Cooperative. Wright, accompanied by two other teens, Jermarius Ellison and Delrano Gracie, had set out to rob Jordan, targeting him for his clothing, shoes, and drugs.
He admitted he and two other friends were trying to rob the 18-year-old at gunpoint.
What began as a simple theft spiraled into something far more devastating. In an instant, Wright pulled the trigger, ending Jordan's life over material possessions that now seemed utterly insignificant. As the courtroom fell silent, Jordan's mother, Karen, stood before the judge, her voice trembling with grief. She spoke of the unbearable void her son's death had left behind, the milestones he would never reach, the celebrations he would never take part in, and the voice she would never hear again. Her pain was raw, and no punishment could ever restore what had been taken from her family. But while Karen was speaking, something unbelievable was happening. Danta was sitting there, smirking as if none of it mattered.
Danta Wright sat in court smiling and nearly laughing as a mother shed tears for her son.
His lack of emotion stunned the entire courtroom. The judge noticed it too, and he didn't hold back. He looked directly at Danta and stated that watching him sit there smiling, laughing, and shaking his head as if the situation were insignificant.
Watching you sit there, smile and laugh and shake your head like this was no big deal,
made him consider rejecting the plea agreement. He warned that if the case went to trial and Wright was convicted of felony murder, he would spend the rest of his life in prison and die there. In the end, Jordan's family decided to accept the plea deal, likely because they wanted some closure. Danta was sentenced to 23 to 50 years for armed robbery, second-degree murder, and conspiracy, plus an extra 2 years for using a gun in the crime. But because of the deal, other charges, including one for a gang-related shooting in 2015, were dropped. When it was Danta's turn to speak, the courtroom waited for any sign of remorse. However, he simply stated that he would be home soon, offering no apology or acknowledgement of Jordan's death. Just hollow words that left the room in stunned silence. Some people thought Danta might be trying to play the insanity card, hoping for a lighter sentence, but it didn't work. The judge saw through it all, and nothing was going to change his fate. After the sentencing, Danta's mother, Antoinette, addressed the situation, shifting the focus to what she believed was a failure of the system rather than the life her son had taken. She argued that the court had disregarded Danta's mental health struggles and appeared more concerned about her son's imprisonment than Jordan's death. Expressing her feelings, she stated that she was sorry for the other mother's loss, but also for her own, emphasizing that Danta had been supposed to graduate that year as well. It was tough to watch, especially knowing what Jordan's family had already been through. This case was a hard one to forget. It's one thing to commit a terrible crime, but to show no empathy afterward, that's a whole different level of heartlessness. Number 1. David Moses. David Moses was a 17-year-old from Bakersfield, California, who, along with two others, participated in a tragic burglary in April 2010. During the crime, they attacked 81-year-old Dorothy Sessions, leading to her death from blunt force trauma.
David Moses sentenced as a teenager to life in prison for killing an 81-year-old woman.
In court, Moses's behavior was notably disrespectful. He showed no remorse for his actions and appeared uninterested in the proceedings. At one point, he fell asleep during the trial, signaling his lack of concern for the gravity of the situation. This attitude deeply affected the victim's family and the community, highlighting the profound impact of courtroom demeanor on public perception. Moses was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.